All right. I'm thinking that I said that we wouldn't have class on the Monday before break. Did I say that? Yeah. No, are we okay with that? Okay. All right. Because it turns out that I thought I was going to be traveling, and it turns out I'm not. So I could do an extra class, but how many would prefer to just skip the Monday? Okay. All right. All right. So last time we were talking about the fact that what Buchanan and Wagner were saying is that you had this Keynesian model that was built into a sort of the idea of a benevolent dictator in some sense, and that you would figure out what y equals c plus I plus g, and you figure out what g you needed to be and what interest rate you needed to be to get to the aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. And it wasn't really built into an idea of a rent-seeking system, a public choice framework where you have rent-seeking and you have a bureaucracy trying to maximize the size of the budget. And the same, also you had this sort of idea in terms of monetary policy as well. Like if you look at Milton Friedman's discussion about why monetary policy has a problem, if you remember that, what did Friedman say about monetary policy? He said that that you have lags, right, in monetary policy. And if you remember back from ECON 203 or 304, and what was the problem? These lags were what? They were long and variable. And so he was saying that, okay, why are we getting these, why isn't this Keynesian model working? It's because the monetary policy is subject to these unpredictable events, and so basically the Federal Reserve sort of goofing it up along the way, right? So this idea of whether this Keynesian model would work or not would sort of fit within this framework of, again, an idea that these were mistakes rather than some sort of institutional setting, right? So that the idea was that mistakes rather than the institutional setting. So if we sort of think about it, you need to sort of put the Federal Reserve in the system as well, right, into this public choice framework. Now, if you go back and look at the old, Samuelson used to be the dominant public standard economics text with micro and macro. And if you look back in the early Samuelson textbooks, he was saying that what you ought to do is you ought to have, if you look back and maybe into the 1960s, the idea was that you would have tight fiscal policy and you'd have loose monetary policy. And then, what he meant by that is that you ought to have the Federal Reserve keep interest rates low, okay? So that why would the Fed keep interest rates low? Because what you want to do is what? Have investment demand go up, right? So the idea is that, remember that, C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports, we sort of ignore that part, that if you're looking at the aggregate demand, what you'd want to do is emphasize the investment demand, right? Because if you have investment demand, then what happens? The capital stock goes up, right? And then what happens? You get higher productivity, and you have GDP rising. But it turns out that the incentives are to go sort of the other way, right? The incentives are to have easy fiscal policy, increasing government spending, lowering taxes, and then to offset this, the aggregate demand getting too far up and getting inflation, what do you have? You'd have to have tight monetary policy. So basically, the if you put it within the public choice framework, you're probably likely to get more increase in government spending and a reduction in taxes than you are going to get higher interest rates. You also remember that there was this thing called the Phillips curve, right? And if we look at the Phillips curve, A.W. Phillips, anybody know when he wrote the article on the Phillips curve? 1958. And what was the Phillips curve about? Phillips curve was about, it says, oh, well, there's some trade-off between inflation, right, and unemployment. And the idea was that if you had, you could have the unemployment rate, if you had high inflation, you could have lower unemployment rates, and that, you know, the Phillips curve, so you'd have this trade-off, okay? You could have trade-off between higher inflation and lower unemployment rates. And then what does Friedman come along? You know, Friedman's always sort of goofing things up on the other side, right? So Friedman comes along and he says, you know what? There is no trade-off, right? This is the natural rate of unemployment. And what was the idea? The idea was that the only way that you could get this trade-off, and so you guys can remember this idea, you know, he said the only way that you could get this trade-off is to what? Have accelerating inflation, right? Because what happens is that you guys will figure out that the real wage is actually not going up, right? The nominal wage is going up, but you guys figure out that the real wage is not going up. So what do? You then ask for higher wages, and so the long run Phillips curve is going to look like this. That is, you can't have this long-term trade-off. You're going to get back to whatever the natural rate of unemployment is. So you have these, you know, in the macro field, you have this idea that we have this macroeconomics theory out there, and this is sort of a why is the economy not moving in the direction that you want it to move? It's probably because people are getting this goofed up, and if you have the right model, then you can solve the problem. But Buchanan and Wagner are saying, look, you need to embed this whole thing in public choice framework. That is, rather than saying there is no trade-off here, but to say that it's not possible in the public choice framework to get the people that are in charge to make the correct decision. That is, they're going to respond to what you guys want to do. Right? They're going to respond to the rent seekers. They're going to respond to the Democrats, or to the bureaucrats. And so Buchanan and Wagner are basically saying, look, here's what's going to happen. We're going to get, whether you believe in the Keynesian model or not, here's what you're going to get. You're going to get, in the long run, you're going to get government spending is going to be going up because people are going to be demanding more government goods. And what are you going to have? You're going to have deficits. You're going to have, and taxes are going to tend to go down. You're going to tend to run deficits. And then what happens with the deficits? Well, what's going to happen there is that the monetary authorities, and we'll talk about this in a minute, that the monetary authorities, what are they going to do? They're going to increase the money supply. And so then what you're going to end up with, inflation. So he's saying that here's what's going to happen if you embed once Keynes comes in and establishes that you don't have to worry like Adam Smith did about being able to sell your bonds requires you to, over the long term, to balance your budget. Otherwise, people will stop buying your bonds. That you don't have to worry about that. That once that happens, then you'll get this increase in government spending over time, and this will embed itself into your economy. And so once Buchanan and Wagner started talking about this, it led people to start to think about, okay, let's look into the institutional framework about how that works. And if for some reason this institutional framework is such that you don't get to the correct monetary and fiscal policy, then you need something like an alarm clock that will set off and say, okay, you got to balance your budget, right? And so the idea here was that Buchanan and Wagner suggest, what they're going to suggest is something like an alarm clock where you're going to say, okay, you need they're going to call for a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. And they recognize that, like, if you've, has anybody ever read Democracy in Deficit? No? So actually, it's not that long a book. So it might be something interesting for you to read. But anyway, they call for a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, but it does have a provision for emergencies, like if you have a war or something like that. But the idea then is to say, okay, this institutional framework is going to be such that you guys are going to be demanding more government goods. You're going to be asking for lower taxes. And so what's going to happen is you're going to keep running bigger and bigger deficits, and that's going to create more and more debt. So, hey, we need to have something in your constitutional framework that stops that from happening, right? Or limits what is happening. So, if again, let's think a little bit about why this would happen. Why would we tend to see in a democratic government, why would we tend to see once you've broken down, once Keynes has come in and said that, hey, we've broken down the Adam Smith idea that, the government ought to balance the budget over the long term, and people don't believe that anymore. Once people don't believe that anymore, then what are we going to end up with? So let's just think about that. You guys are running for office, and what's going to happen is you're going to have competition among the candidates. And competition among the candidates, what's going to happen? You're going to say, okay, I'm going to increase government spending and I'm going to reduce taxes. Okay? So I'm going to say, look, I'm going to have a Build Back America, and we're going to build all sorts of cool things in Hillsdale, and we'll be able to have free child care, and we'll be able to have free K through 12 education, and then we'll have free tuition for community colleges or whatever, right? And I'm not going to raise your taxes to do that. Now somebody else is running, and what are they going to say? They're going to say, if we can do these, we can provide these public goods, but we're going to have to raise your taxes to do that. Now, if you are a rationally ignorant person that hasn't had ECON 203 or whatever, then what are you going to think? You're going to think, oh, okay, I'm better off getting the government spending, and even if you're going to raise, even if what you're going to do is you're going to run debt, we've already talked about the fact that that's going to happen out in the future, right? And I might not be the person that's going to have to pay for that. So basically what's going to happen is there's going to be a bias towards what? Towards government spending. There's going to be a bias towards a large public sector. And there's going to be a bias towards inflation. Now, if we think about it, the market competition is continuous, okay? When you're trying to decide whether to, if what I'm doing is I'm trying to sell you a new cell phone, I'm trying to come up with a new cell phone, that is continuously going on, right? You don't know, tomorrow somebody could come up with a new cell phone or whatever. Whereas political competition is not continuous, right? Political competition is intermittent. And so, just as a point here, political competition is intermittent. You don't elect your congressperson or you don't elect your senators every 6 months or something. You have Congress every 2 years and the Senate every 6 years. And so market competition is going on continuously, whereas political competition only happens every now and then. So then you get to choose among the people that your candidates. But it's also all or nothing, right? Right? You either get a Democrat or you get a Republican or you get a Libertarian or whatever. You don't get, gee, I'd like to have I'd like to have a person that's 60% Republican and 40% Democrat, right? I want them to vote for, the things that the NRA are for, but I want them to also deal with the inequality or whatever. You're going to get an all or nothing choice, right? So that's a different way of looking at it in terms of just realizing that your choices in the market are different than your choices in the political realm. Now, also one thing to look at is in terms of government spending is the difference between discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Now, the discretionary spending is there's 12 appropriations bills, right? And each of these appropriations bills are supposed to be voted on one at a time, but they all normally aren't. They end up with a reconciliation bill that lumps them all into one spot. But these are the things that happen each year, okay? Excuse me. This is what discretionary spending. And mandatory spending, that's set by law. So, the spending on Social Security isn't appropriated every year, okay? You don't have an appropriations bill that talks about here's what Social Security is. Discretionary spending, you do. Let's say you have the spending on defense, okay? So the Defense Department has their budget, and the defense spending doesn't happen unless there's an appropriation for the defense spending. Now, as I said before, rather than the 12 appropriations bills being passed, they tend to lump them all into one bill at the end and combine it all. But and of course, you guys again are rashly ignorant about what's in that bill. But nonetheless, it's an appropriation bill. And for example, the money that's been spent on the infrastructure bill that just passed, okay? That's an appropriations bill, and it's going to say, okay, here's how much is going to be spent each year over, and so it's in the statute for that way. But Social Security doesn't matter. The Social Security spending is going to happen whether there's an appropriation or not. If enough people turn 65 or 67, depending on how old they are when they hit Social Security, then that's how much is going to get spent. Medicaid, how much gets spent on Medicaid? Just whatever you guys, if you turn 65 and you get Medicaid, then you go to the hospital or whatever the statute says, that's how much gets spent. Now, the interesting thing about that is that if you look at discretionary spending, see if we think about, okay, should we balance the budget, right? Suppose that you guys are saying, oh yeah, we need to balance the budget, right? Guess what? Can't do it. If you really think about it, if we just said, we want to run a balanced budget next year, really can't do it. Why not? Take a look at the difference between the mandatory and discretionary spending. If we look at, this is for fiscal year 2020 that's already happened, right? These are actual numbers for fiscal year 2020. For fiscal year 2020, if we look at discretionary, Discretionary spending, the total of that was 1.627 trillion. Of that, 714 was defense. 714 billion was defense. Okay? If we look at mandatory spending, this was for fiscal year 2020, mandatory spending was 4.578 trillion. So the net interest on the debt, let's say we've got to pay the interest on the debt, right? So net interest on the debt was 345 billion. And total receipts were 3.42 trillion. Okay? So total receipts were 3.4 trillion. That means if you didn't pass any of the appropriations bills, the mandatory spending was $4.578 trillion, and your total receipts were only 3.4 trillion. Now, fiscal year 2020 had some extra parts to it in that you had the COVID relief package and that sort of thing, right? That was statutory, and the extended benefits and unemployment. So if you were unemployed, that money came whether it was appropriated or not. Okay, but if we just take a look on the discretionary side, or excuse me, the mandatory side, if we look at Social Security, if we break out the mandatory into Social Security, Social Security is 1.09 trillion. Medicare was 769 billion. Medicaid was 458 billion. Those programs then, if we add these up and you take net interest on the debt, you're going to see that if you didn't even spend, if you spent the $700 billion on defense, if you paid for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, you're going to still run a deficit, right? If you pay for net interest on the debt. So what does that tell you? It tells you that from a public choice perspective, how are you going to balance the budget? You got to come in and you got to say, guess what? We got to deal with these things. What's the probability that somebody's going to be running for office in 2024 and say, here's what we need to do. We need to cut back on Social Security, right? Does that seem like, and we already looked at voter turnout, right? What age group has higher voter turnout, right? The older people have higher voter turnout, right? And so now if you were to really do this, one of the things that they're trying to do is do what? To limit what was going to happen in the Build Back Better. What are you going to do? You're going to increase Medicare to cover what? Prescription drugs and dental, right? What's that going to end up doing? That's going to end up driving this mandatory spending, isn't it? Which is going to make it harder to make it so that you could possibly have a balanced budget. If the only way that you can really deal with saying we're going to have a balanced budget is to deal with these three things. Is it likely that anybody running for office is going to be talking about reducing Medicare? No, they're talking about expanding Medicare. But what are they talking about doing? Limiting prescription drugs, right? They're going to limiting prescription drug prices so that the federal government is going to be able to limit what the spending is in Medicare and Medicaid on prescription drugs. Okay, so there's an attempt to try to deal with it in a roundabout fashion, but realistically, the only way that you're going to deal with this, where we've got to the point that we are, that we've got federal deficits that are very large, how are you going to deal with that, right? You're going to have to deal with the mandatory spending, and there doesn't seem to be a good way to deal with that. Another thing is that when you are in the market, when you are buying something, you know what you're paying. Whoever's buying, what do you do? You know what you're paying. But when you're voting for government goods, when you're voting for someone that is out there running for office, what you're really doing is in the political system, you're really not to say buying, but you're really voting for a candidate, or you're voting for an agent who's not bound by specific actions, right? You get an agent who is not bound by specific actions. So again, there's a big difference between the political side of things and the market side of things. One of the interesting things about when you're looking at the public choice framework of this thing is that what is a budget surplus? Suppose that I say, you know what, we're going to balance the budget. How are we going to do that? Okay, we're going to have to increase taxes, and we're going to have to reduce government spending, right? So if I'm going to balance the budget, I have to increase taxes and reduce government spending. Okay? What's the problem here? The problem here is when I increase taxes, there are losers and no gainers. You guys, if I raise taxes, you guys aren't going to be, none of you are better off individually if I raise your taxes. But if I reduce government spending, then what happens? Then, if I reduce government spending, there are winners, if I increase taxes, there are losers and no gainers. If I reduce taxes, if I reduce government spending, there are losers and no gainers. So, if I'm just out there trying to argue for a balanced budget, what's going to happen? The only way I can do that is to reduce government spending or increase taxes. How many in here are going to say, oh yeah, I'm all for that individually? Individually, it's your best interest to say, hey, I don't want that, right? Because I individually am going to be worse off by a reduction in government spending, but the economy may be better off in the long term, but for me individually, I'm going to be moving towards wanting to have an increase in government spending and a reduction in taxes. So there's no obvious gainers in somebody coming out and running for office and running on a balanced budget. If again we've talked about the fact that if people start to believe in a balanced budget and are worried about what's going to happen, then once they sort of go back and get rid of this Keynesian idea and say, wait a minute, we're going to have a long-term problem in the economy if we do this, then we noted that you could have a political movement in the other direction, which we noted is part of what's going on in the last election in Virginia, et cetera. But if we just look at, basically if we look at historically, again, Buchanan and Wagner write this thing in 1977. If we look at historically, if we look from 1960 to today, the only fiscal surpluses were 1969, which was a small surplus. Oops, 1969. And actually, during the Clinton administration, we had 1998 through 2001. So we had surpluses in that period, and the largest surplus was 128 billion. And part of why that happened in the Clinton administration was a restoring of this idea that we need to have a balanced budget. In fact, one of the things that happened was there was a debate over the raising of the debt limit. And I don't know if you're following this or not, we'll talk about it a little bit more, is that there's an issue about, anybody know when the debt limit needs to be raised before the government can't pay its bonds back? Think about that. In mid-December, right? So about mid-December, there's and we'll talk about this in a minute, but in mid-December, there's going to be an issue about can the Federal Reserve, can the Treasury pay back the bond that it owes? How does it normally pay it back? In order to pay back your bond, it's that this bond becomes due on December 1st. Normally what it does is that it sells another bond to pay off the one that is due on December 1st. If it can't sell a new bond, then it's going to not be able to pay off, because why? Because you've got all this mandatory spending that's out there, and you have appropriations bills that have said, here's how much we're going to spend. What are you going to have to do? You'd have to run in and reduce the appropriations bills, but you're late into the fiscal year, so that's going to create a problem. And I don't know if you've been following this, but that's an issue that's been coming up, is that what are they going to do about the debt limit increase in December? But anyway, the largest surplus was 128 billion. If we look at the $1 trillion deficits, right? So the largest budget surplus, $128 billion, Buchanan and Wagner saying, hey, in 1977, they're saying, hey, look, what are we going to have? We're going to keep having budget deficits, and we're going to have, the debt's going to be going up, and that's what we're going to see. What do you see? The fiscal surpluses, you did have them in the Clinton administration, but if you look at fiscal year 2009 to 2012, what did you have? You had $1 trillion deficits. Okay, so that's a pretty big deficit, because if you even think about it, anybody know when the first $1 trillion budget was? The first time we ever spent $1 trillion in appropriations, total outlays? I have any historical record here? 1987 was the first $1 trillion in outlays. So the first time that the federal government ever spent $1 trillion was 1987. By 2009, we're running deficits of $1 trillion, right? And we run these deficits over $1 trillion from 2009 to 2012. Now, fiscal year 2020, as I just sort of pointed out, had, which is when we just looked at the mandatory spending, the total spending there. If you look at fiscal 2019, it was the deficit in 2019 was $984 billion. If you look at fiscal year 2020, it was $3.1 trillion. So the first budget that you ever get that's $1 trillion is in 1987, and in fiscal year 2020, you run a deficit of $3.1 trillion. Okay? So maybe Buchanan and Wagner had an insight here. That is there something in the public choice framework that says, hey, guess what? You're going to have bigger and bigger government and more deficits. How can you get bigger government? Because you guys think that you're getting these government goods basically for free, right? In fact, that's almost what you hear. And again, we've talked about modern monetary theory, so the idea is we just create money and don't worry about it, right? And so you get that. Now, if we look at the Congressional Budget Office, the Congressional Budget Office is one of the better places to go for looking at the economic data in terms of the budget. And they have a budget and financial outlook. Their CBO is the Budget and Financial Outlook. In their latest, they have an update, was July of 2021. And what they estimated was that as a percentage of gross domestic product, now GDP is much larger, right? So if we're looking at, yeah, we're running trillion-dollar deficits, but what's happening to the deficit in terms of the size of the economy? If we look at fiscal year 2021, CBO estimated as nearly about 15%, a little bit less of GDP. This was the fiscal year 2020. So the deficit running at about 15% of GDP, that's the largest number since World War II as a percentage of GDP. So you ran a substantially high budget deficit. Now, of course, we had the COVID situation, and so you had a lot of mandatory spending that went out that way. But nonetheless, what do you have? You have a very high budget deficit. Now, notice that some people win from inflation and deficits, right? Think about this. If you have winners from inflation and deficits, well, who's a winner if you have a deficit? Notice that what we said was that you have an increase in the inflation over time. So who benefits from inflation? Commodity owners, right? Commodity owners benefit from inflation. Anybody know what's been happening to the price of oil? All right. Price of oil's gone up from about $60 a barrel to over $80 a barrel. Okay. You own ExxonMobil. Maybe you should have bought ExxonMobil stock, right? If you own oil, then inflation's a good thing for you. Also, if you are a borrower, if you're the federal government, what are you doing? 30-year Treasury notes are at what? Less than 2%, right? 30-year Treasury notes are at less than 2%. What does that tell you? They give you $1,000 today, right? And then 30 years from now, what happens? They give you back $1,000. But if inflation is running at 4.6% or 6.2%, which is what it ran, last month, it ran at about 6.2% on an annual basis last month, then what's happening? They're paying you back dollars that are worth less. So anybody that's a borrower is going to gain from inflation. So not everybody's losing from inflation. The real wages have gone down. I don't know if you've been looking at the numbers, but the real wages have gone down recently because of the inflation that just has been beginning to spike. And so a lot of people are losers, but there are some people that are gainers from this idea of us having a budget deficit resulting in inflation over the long run. So basically what Buchanan and Wagner argue is that when you remove this idea of a balanced budget principle, it created a asymmetry in the budgeting process. And when you have a competitive democracy where I'm running against you, you guys are, again, a number of you be rationally ignorant. And so what will happen is you'll think that, hey, we can just increase government spending and reduce taxes, and I'm better off. And so there'll be a bias in that direction. But, you know, at some point that we talked about the fact that in the 2010 election, right, in the 2014 elections, this idea of, hey, maybe we ought to have a balanced budget and reduce the debt, that came back into the public choice perspective and resulted in a win for the off election. Now, Buchanan and Wagner's main point is that voters don't realize the true cost of public goods, right? I mean, that's sort of the, if we sort of think through this, what's their main point? Their main point is voters don't know the true price of government goods. You guys think government goods are cheaper than they really are. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that you're going to demand more. And what will that do? That will lead to an increase in the debt because you're going to be running deficits. And what will happen? This will demand more. You'll have deficits increase and debt increases. Let me just give you a few numbers here just to give you an idea, and then we'll talk more about this on Friday. But if you, a good place to go for economic data is the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. They have, it's called FRED. It's the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and this is their website where they post all sorts of data, and it's a good data source. Now, if we look at, and there's also unfortunately, this is no longer there, but they have a total debt to the penny. That used to be posted, but now that site has been moved over. There's a bunch of changes that went on when they eliminated the reserve requirement. I don't know if you've been following this. We'll talk more about this next time, but they eliminated the reserve requirement altogether. If you can think back to ECON 203, right? Used to think there was a 10% reserve requirement where there is no reserve requirement now. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about what that happened. But if we look at look at debt. Now, when you look at the total debt, it's made up of two components. The debt is made up of intragovernmental holdings. And what is that? That is where the Social Security Trust Fund, right, has when Social Security runs a positive where receipts are coming in more than are going out, okay? Not as many old people out there, lots of young people out there. You guys are all paying your Social Security taxes. It's going now, more money's coming into the Social Security Trust than is going out. What do? They have a Social Security Trust Fund, okay? And how does this Social Security Trust Fund work? It works that the Social Security Trust Fund owns government debt, non-marketable securities. It holds non-marketable securities that are debt that is owed by the Treasury Department to the Social Security Trust Fund. So intergovernmental holdings include basically the big component of that is Social Security and Medicare trust funds. And so what is that? That just says that Treasury owes Social Security Trust Fund money. right? And these are held in bonds. Now, the Social Security Trust Fund can't, if it's got a $1,000 Treasury bond, it can't go out and sell it to you. It is a non-marketable security. So it just says the Social Security Trust Fund owns a $1,000 bond and says that Social Security is going to pay for that, or excuse me, the Treasury is going to pay for that when it becomes due. So what happens is when the more money is coming or going out than coming in, what does the Social Security Trust Fund have to do? They have to sell that bond and they give it back to Treasury. Now, what does Treasury have to do? If Treasury is going to pay back, okay, if Treasury pays the bond to the Social Security Trust Fund, then what it's got to do? It's got to reduce government spending, it's got to increase taxes, or it's got to go out and sell a bond, right? Sell a regular bond out to you guys, okay? Now, realistically, suppose there was no Social Security Trust Fund, and the statute says this is how much money's got to go out. What's going to happen? The government is going to, Treasury is either going to have, where's going to get the money to go out and spend the more money on Social Security? It's going to have to do this exact same thing, right? It's going to have to reduce government spending, increase taxes, or sell a bond. So the Social Security Trust Fund is not really a trust fund, okay? It's really one government agency saying it owes another government agency something. So the point here is that there is an amount of the debt, when you see that debt that's out there, the public debt, it's made up of one government agency owing another government agency. Then it's the amount that actually is that you guys own. That is the bonds that you own or that the Chinese government owns. That is called debt held by the public. And just to close here, just to give you an idea of that amount, in the November 15th, as of November 15th, the total debt was $28.9 trillion. The intergovernmental holdings was $6.238 trillion, and the debt held by the public, which is those bonds that are actually out there in the market, debt held by the public was $22.670 trillion. That's the number that really has to be paid. Like when if they don't pay those bonds back, then we say, okay, you're defaulted. So the debt held by the public is really the number that you need to be concerned about. So for next time, what we'll do is we'll basically finish this the democracy and deficit. We'll talk a little bit about why you haven't seen as much inflation as you might have expected, why that happened, even though the Fed's been buying up lots and lots of bonds, right? In 2003, you would have learned that would have increased the money supply, et cetera. So why that inflation start to happen? And then we'll move into voting with your feet, the next section, Charles Thibault idea of voting with your feet.